The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, where Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Be seated. Good morning. Good morning. Wonderful to be here with you this morning. I met with the vestry yesterday and heard lots of good things about what's going on here, and there certainly seems to be a good spirit and good energy here. And they told me at the vestry that the attendance at Christ the King has doubled in the last 2 years. So that's my new standard for the rest of the diocese. And, every church should have that as its goal. But that speaks volumes to the spirit of the place. Certainly has something to do with the leadership of Olin and John. But we all know, or we should know, clergy sometimes forget this, and sometimes lay people don't mind forgetting it either, that it's not just the clergy. There is a good spirit in this place that has to do with the whole body, and that's exciting. New parking lot, new paint job, the vestry, the sacristy has been redone, and those can seem like minor kind of things, but they speak to a vitality and to a hopefulness and a vision of the future, and that is marvelous. God's not done with us yet, and the Holy Spirit's not done with Christ the King or Holy Nativity. So, well done, y'all. Good for you. I'm not actually from the South, but Indiana is where I'm from, and they say it's the most southern state north of the Mason-Dixon line, so every now and then I slip a y'all in. But well done, well done. It's encouraging for me, and it's a joy to be here, and it's fun to be here to celebrate the 65th anniversary of the founding of Christ the King, so that's exciting. I want to look a bit with you this morning at the passage from the Old Testament, the famous passage of Samuel and Eli. And it occurred to me for the first time, actually, last night when I heard this lesson over again, that I've always assumed that the setting for this story was nighttime, because everybody's asleep. But, and up until recently, I've identified with Samuel in the story, the youngster. But not, I'm getting older, and so now I'm a little more inclined to identify with Eli, whose eyesight has begun to grow dim and is not the young man that he once was. So it occurred to me last night that maybe this is at nighttime, but maybe Eli, this older guy, has this young guy living with him, and some of you who are grandparents have experienced this. You're tired, and so who has to take a nap? I saw a cartoon once that said, "How come every time my mom's tired, I have to take a nap?" So maybe this is the afternoon, and Eli's just kind of had enough of this young kid running around. He said, "Okay, Samuel, go take a nap," and then Eli went and took a nap. I don't know. Maybe it was nighttime, but in any event, Eli's laying down, Samuel's laying down, and Samuel hears the Lord calling his name and is not quite familiar with the sound of the Lord's voice. He thinks it's Eli. You heard the story, so I won't rehearse the whole story. But here's the question I want to ask you, and I want you to think about this. Have you ever heard the Lord calling your name? Maybe not out loud like Samuel did, but have you ever experienced in your spirit God calling you, God speaking His mercy and delight into your heart, His forgiveness, His encouragement, His hope, His transformation? Or as the passage says a little bit later, have your ears ever tingled? Or has your heart tingled with the sense of God's presence? And think about that for a moment. Maybe you've had some experiences like that. If you haven't had a clear, obvious, or dramatic experience like that, that doesn't mean that you're not a good, faithful Christian or that God's not speaking to you. But I'm convinced that the Holy Spirit is always singing a love song into our hearts. And one reason why we are encouraged over and over again to practice some quiet space, carve out space in our day for silence and for prayer, is so that we can hear. So we can quiet the voices that are going on in our heads, the noise around us, so that we can hear God singing His love song into our heart. I hope that you've heard at least a bit of that love song. And if you haven't, I encourage you to spend some time in quiet prayerfulness and listen, because the fact that you haven't heard it doesn't mean God's not singing it to you. And I want to share with you briefly one experience of mine. This is one of the more dramatic ones, and I haven't had lots of dramatic experiences like this, but I want to share this one with you just to encourage you to think about it yourself. And because I want us, and I think this is an important thing, Episcopalians are not very good at this, but we need to get better at it, be willing to share our own stories with one another. And if you've got an experience of God speaking to you and your heart tingling, be willing to once in a while share that with somebody else and share those stories, because I think that's important for us. So here's my story, a little bit of a setup. I was actually in seminary, so it wasn't the first time that I experienced some kind of call. But I was in seminary, and in seminary I was expected to do a thing called pastoral education, which is like being a chaplain intern for the summer and going to a hospital. And we got to the hospital and was assigned a floor. And I hadn't had a whole lot of training yet, so I was assigned a floor and just told to go, start walking around the floor and introduce myself to the nurses, and then go door to door and just stick my head in and say, hello, I'm the chaplain, can I do anything for you? Do you need a prayer? We'd like to talk. And so, engaging a whole range of folks who were in the hospital for things relatively minor, or things very grave. Some of them, people realizing that they were at the end of their life and dealing with the kinds of things that come up with that. So I was thrown in with that. And then the other thing we do at clinical pastoral education is there's a group of you from different seminaries, and there's a supervisor, and they do kind of group therapy, which is great fun if you've ever been in something like this, where at some point they take the time and they do your evaluation, and they tell you what they think your strengths are, and then they tell you what they think your growing edges are, which is great fun. It's thinking like, let me tell you where you've got emotional broccoli in your teeth. Which is actually helpful in the long run, right? But it's not fun to hear in the moment. And so there was that going on. And the seminary itself, you're dealing with all kinds of big questions and things. And then there was also individual kind of therapy with the supervisor. So all kinds of things getting stirred up, right? So that's just kind of the context. One night, while I was doing this, I was the person on call. I was the chaplain on call, and I was there late at night and in the chaplain's office, and just grappling with a whole host of the swirl of things that were going on because of all this. And getting in touch with some pain and consternation and old hurts and wounds, and we've all got some of those, and mine aren't particularly bad compared to some folk, but there's enough stuff getting stirred up. And then without trying to come up with it, I was given an image. So I'm calling this a graced image. Not a vision. Visions are still rare these days, even as they were in Samuel's day. But a graced image. And here was the image. The image was, I was about 14 years old, And I was standing at the top of a tower of a castle looking out the window, and most of the rest of the castle was in disrepair or had been damaged as if it had been attacked, and much of it had been destroyed, and the tower was the only thing that was still really intact. And I was looking out at the rest of the castle and at the landscape around, and the landscape around had looked like it had been ravaged. The trees were torn down, and the grass was all torn up, as if an army had just run over all over the land. Which, you don't have to be much of a psychologist to understand that was kind of the territory of my spirit, and just kind of looking at some of the devastation that was at some of the core of myself. And so I was looking at it, and then as the image kind of unfolded, down the road, there's a road from the castle into the distance, and down the road a figure began to walk. And as the figure got closer, it was clear that it was a woman, but it wasn't clear how old she was. She was of indeterminate age, young or old, it wasn't clear, but she was indescribably beautiful. And she walked down the road, closer and closer to the castle, and she got to the base of the tower, and she was barefoot, and she sat at the edge of the moat at the base of the castle, at the bottom of this tower, and she dangled her toes, her bare feet in the water, and she looked up at me, and I'm looking down, and she started to sing to me. And the words of the song were not particularly profound, at least they don't sound profound in the retelling, but the words were something along the lines of, "Be at peace, it's all right. Let me heal the land. Come and join me, and let us heal the land." So the land of your spirit, which needs healing, but then let's be about healing of the land around you as well. It's not just about you. And it was a profoundly grace-filled word to me at that moment. And I cherish that. I haven't had lots of those, but if you've had any of those, you cherish one of those and you hope maybe for another one down the road. But in the meantime, you live between the grace times when you felt things were more clear than they normally are. For that moment, things seemed really clear. God was real in a way that God's not always that real. The Word of God was clear in a way that wasn't always clear, and it was profoundly healing. You can talk to Lester, there's still plenty of work that he's doing in my healing, but there was a profound time of healing. And I think, as I said, that you have experienced some glimpse of that, some foretaste of the kingdom, and if you haven't, I encourage you to spend some time quietly praying and inviting the Holy Spirit to do what the Holy Spirit does, which is to bring God's healing, God's forgiveness, God's transformation. And I've been encouraging everybody to do this. At our convention last year, we talked about the passage, different gospel from this morning, but in Luke 5, there's a passage about Peter, the fisherman who's been fishing all night, which is the time that they did the fishing, and they caught nothing. And then this preacher guy shows up, Jesus, and does his preaching thing, and then he says to Peter, "Did you catch any fish?" And Peter says, "No." And Jesus goes, "Well, why don't you go back out and cast in the deep?" And I always imagine Peter going, "I tell you what, you stick to the preaching, let me do the fishing." But Peter does go back out and into the deep. And as the story unfolds, he catches more fish than you were dreaming of catching. And the motto of the Diocese of Fond du Lac, years and years ago, was "In Altum," which is the Latin for "into the deep." So I want to encourage us to commit ourselves to going into the deep, which means for each one of us as members of the church to commit ourselves to going into the deep in our relationship with God, where there is healing and forgiveness and transformation and mending of the tear. If each of us does that, that's where the real healing and transformation in our own lives happens. But then to go into the deep as congregations, we are supposed to be the body of Christ. We are supposed to be a foretaste of the kingdom of God. We're supposed to be a community that practices what it looks like to be mending the tear, to be peacemakers and reconcilers and forgivers and truth tellers, speaking the truth in love. To practice that amongst ourselves, to be a people of God's mercy and delight, to go deeper into that. And so that's two. And then the third thing is to go deeper into our communities, a community that is full of people who are lonely, who are hurting, who need to hear of mercy besides shame, something besides whoever has the most toys wins, who needs to hear something besides it's a world that's dog eat dog, to hear that there is something bigger than what's right in front of our face, to go deeper into our community. And there, I heard from the vestry last night that there's an awful lot that you all are already doing. So that's great. But we can never rest on our laurels. We can always go deeper. I need to go deeper in my own journey with God. The diocese and each congregation needs to go deeper into being a people of God's mercy and delight. And however much we're doing, we can always think to ourselves, what's the next thing we could be doing to go deeper into our community with the good news of what God is doing in Jesus Christ amongst us and in the world. So let's go deeper and let's practice talking to one another about the times when we have had our hearts tingling at hearing the voice of God calling.